You've probably heard the story of the space race. The United States versus the Soviet Union, rockets blasting off, astronauts floating into space, and in 1969, Neil Armstrong setting foot on the moon. But what about Britain? After all, this was a country that once ruled a quarter of the world. It had scientists, engineers, and global influence. So why didn't Britain ever try to land its own astronauts on the moon? Well, the answer is a mix of politics, economics, and some very British pragmatism. Let's dig into it. To understand why Britain never aimed for the moon, you have to rewind to the late 1940s and early 1950s. World War II had just ended and Britain was on the winning side, but victory came at a huge price. The war had drained Britain's economy, destroyed much of its infrastructure, and left the country deeply in debt to the United States. While the US emerged as the world's richest superpower and the Soviet Union transformed into a global military rival, Britain was struggling to just rebuild homes, repair cities bombed during the Blitz, and ultimately feed its people. The space programs are expensive, really expensive, and in 1945 Britain simply didn't have the money to pour into a lunar dream. Now here's the twist. Britain actually did have rocket technology. During World War II, German engineers developed the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. After the war, the United States and the Soviet Union scrambled to capture the scientists behind it, most famously Wernher von Braun, who would go on to lead NASA's Apollo rocket program. Britain also studied the V-2 and developed its own missiles, like the Blue Streak in the 1950s. Blue Streak was a powerful rocket, so powerful it could have been used as the basis for a space launch vehicle. But the British government didn't see much point in developing it for space exploration. Instead, they saw it as mainly a nuclear deterrent, a weapon to carry Britain's atomic bombs. And when they realised that Blue Streak would be vulnerable to Soviet attacks if launched from the ground, they cancelled it as a weapons project. For space, they just weren't interested. Meanwhile, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in very public, very expensive competition for global prestige. For the Soviets, launching Sputnik in 1957 wasn't just about science. It was about proving that communism was modern, powerful, and capable of leading the future. For the Americans, catching up in space was about proving that capitalism could do it better. Landing on the moon wasn't really about science either. It was about showing the world which system was superior. Britain wasn't in that rivalry. By the 1950s, it was clear that the world's two superpowers were Washington and Moscow, not London. So while the US and the USSR were spending billions on rockets and astronauts, Britain was more focused on rebuilding its economy, running the newly found National Health Service, and managing the slow breakup of the British Empire. In short, the space race was never Britain's race to begin with. Still, you might wonder, couldn't Britain have tried at least? Well, let's look at the costs. The Apollo program, which got Americans to the moon, cost around $25 billion in 1960s money. Adjusted to inflation, that's well over $150 billion today. That was about 4% of the entire US federal budget at the time. Britain simply couldn't afford to devote that kind of money to space. Even if the government wanted to, taxpayers would never have accepted it, not when the country was rationing food into the 1950s and rebuilding bombed-out cities. In the eyes of British politicians, it made much more sense to let the Americans spend huge sums and then benefit from the science and technology that then trickled down. That doesn't mean that Britain ignored space entirely. In fact, Britain made some important contributions. In the 1960s, Britain developed the Prospero satellite, which was successfully launched in 1971. That made Britain the sixth nation to launch its own satellite on its own rocket. But even that programme was short-lived. After Prospero, Britain cancelled its independent rocket projects, deciding it was too costly to compete with the superpowers. Instead, Britain shifted towards international cooperation, joining organisations like ESRO, the European Space Research Organisation, a forerunner of today's ESA, the European Space Agency. So while Britain never sent people to the moon, it did help build satellites, telescopes and carry out scientific missions as part of a larger shared effort. Another key reason Britain didn't go to the moon is that the scientists didn't really want to. In the 1950s and 60s, British scientists argued that robotic probes and satellites were far more cost efficient than sending humans into space. From a purely scientific perspective, they weren't wrong. You could learn a lot about the moon and Mars or the planets by sending robotic explorers at a fraction of the cost and without risking human life. The Americans and Soviets, though, weren't thinking about just science. They were thinking about prestige, propaganda, and national pride. Britain's leaders decided that prestige wasn't worth bankrupting the country. You might imagine that the British public would have been excited about the idea of a moon landing, but polls at the time actually showed the opposite. In the 1960s, most Britons thought the American space program was wasteful. Many newspapers mocked it as a vanity project, while poverty and inequality persisted around the world. If the US could barely justify the cost, then Britain had no chance of selling it politically. There's also a psychological factor here. By the 1960s, Britain was adjusting to life as a country that was no longer the world's dominant empire. The Suez Crisis of 1956 had made it painfully clear that Britain could no longer act like a global superpower without American backing. Instead of chasing after the prestige of a moon landing, Britain leaned into a different kind of international role, more modest, more cooperative, more realistic about its economic and political limits. So while America was planting a flag on the moon, Britain was investing in scientific research, nuclear power, and industries that it thought would be more practical. Now let's imagine just for fun that Britain had tried. Could they have pulled it off? Well, probably not, at least not alone. Even if Britain had decided in the 1950s to go to the moon, the resources just weren't there. The US had a booming economy and poured billions into Apollo. The Soviets devoted a huge percentage of their budget to space, despite their struggles. Britain's economy was too weak, its political system too cautious, and the Great British public were too sceptical. The best bet would have been some kind of joint European programme, but in the 1960s, European nations were still rebuilding and weren't yet ready to collaborate on something that ambitious. So realistically, Britain never stood a chance of going to the moon in that era. Fast forward to today, and Britain is still not in the business of sending astronauts to the moon. Instead, it's a key partner in the European Space Agency, contributing to missions like the Rosetta Comet probe and the ExoMars rover. Britain also has a growing private space industry, focusing on small satellite launches and space technology. So while Britain never had its own Apollo moment, it's still very much a spacefaring nation, just in a quieter, more collaborative way. But why didn't Britain go to the moon? Well, because by the time the space race started, Britain was a country recovering from war, was very short on money, and was losing its empire, and it was more focused on rebuilding at home. The moon landings were a superpower project designed to showcase national pride and global dominance. Britain simply wasn't in that league anymore. Instead, it chose a more practical path, building satellites, working with Europe, and letting the Americans and Soviets fight for the glory. And while it might not be as dramatic as planting a flag on the moon, it's kept Britain a player in space science to this day. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into Britain's space story, make sure to click subscribe for more history and science explained. And also let us know in the comments, if Britain had gone to the moon or tried to do it, do you think they could have pulled it off? Thanks again for watching.